All right, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, sentient creations of all shapes, colors, and sizes, welcome to the second episode of LiveFreeTV right here on the Voluntary Virtues Network. I'm your host, Nathan Frazier. I'm also the host of a radio show called Live Free FM. If you want to check that out, go over to livefreefm.com. And there is a plethora of archives on subjects that are very similar to what I'm going to be talking about tonight. And tonight I am going to be talking about the theory of property rights, or the concept of property in general. So I guess let's start off with a little bit of definition. That's probably the best way to start any conversation. So property itself is a concept. The resources are real, but property is a concept or an idea on how those resources relate to us human beings. So property is a concept on our relationship to resources which are real. All rights, including property rights, are merely conceptual. And this might be like something that people are jumping up and down, screaming at the screen, being like, what? That's the stupidest thing. God gave us our rights. The Constitution gave us our rights. My rights are inalienable. Well, rights are just a theory. Rights are a concept. And some concepts are good, like the concept of personal rights. Property rights, in my opinion, are a good concept. Some concepts are good. Some concepts, when acted upon and when realized in interactions between human beings, some concepts will lead to a prosperous society, will lead to a more free society, and some concepts will lead to horrible oppression and great depressions and not very prosperous society. So I'm going to talk about the different concepts that are the different ideas and conceptualizations that different groups of people have about the particular concept of property. And so we're going to look at property from a couple different points of view, and then I'm going to give you my point of view on the concept of property and property ownership. So first of all, for those of you who were able to catch last week's episode of Live Free TV, I gave a little bit of my background, and I mentioned that I came from a heavily leaning leftist, socialist, anarcho-socialist kind of background. I grew up poor and on welfare and without very much personal property and with absolutely no private property, as the rhetoric on the left side of the political spectrum goes. So I understand. I wouldn't say that I hold tight to these concepts that are often held by people on this end of the political spectrum. But I do understand these ideas, and I actually did hold to these ideas for a large part of my younger life. And so I'm going to talk about these, and I'm not going to speak on them as an authority or speak on them as this is how everybody in the group that calls themselves socialist or leftist, this is how they all feel about this stuff. I'm just going to give my understanding and my experience with these mindsets and the concepts of property and property ownership from that point of view. So the socialist view of property is that the state owns everything. And since we are the state, we, the people, make up the state, everything belongs to everybody. Nobody, no individual owns property individually. We, as a society or as a group of people, we own all the property equally, but at the same time, none of us own any of the property individually. So it's kind of a collective mentality where collectively we own all this property, but individually nobody owns anything. And that's kind of the socialist view. Socialism itself is an economic philosophy or an economic model where the state owns all of the means of production. That means the state prints the money, the state owns the car manufacturers. The state owns all the utilities. The state owns the water. The state owns all the land. And ultimately, the state owns all of the human beings that reside upon that land. And so in that theory, everybody owns everybody, but the state, the manifestation of the collective will, actually ends up owning everything. So I'm not a big fan of that. But a lot of people that are a big fan of that, they come up with this property is theft meme. It's something that it's one of those weaponized words where they turn this phrase into a club and they just beat you over the head with it every time that when you're trying to have an intelligent conversation with them, they resort to this club of property is theft, property is theft, property is theft. And they just beat you over the head with it until you finally say, okay, I'm just going to leave because this is way too painful. But property is theft. The meme itself, the idea itself it's logically flawed. It's a fallacy. Property is theft. Just look at those words. Theft implies property. You can't steal something that somebody doesn't own. And property implies that somebody owns something. So in order for something to be stolen, it has to first be owned. In order for something to be owned, it has to be property. You can't steal a resource that's not owned by anybody. The only way you can commit theft is by taking a resource that somebody else has a claim on. So the idea of property is theft is circular logic. You can't have theft without property. So property cannot be theft. And the concept of property cannot be theft because the concept of theft only exists if the concept of property is legitimate. So when somebody hits you over the head with the property is theft club, just understand that they don't understand what they're talking about. So moving on from the strict socialist statist point of view to the anarcho-socialist or the anarcho-communist point of view, some people call these ANSOCs and ANCOMs. They view property a little bit differently. A lot of them, and I don't want to lump them all up into a group. This is just from conversations that I've had with a lot of people. And what I tend to get as feedback for the way that they view property is they break up property into two different types. There's good property and there's bad property. Good property is called personal property. Bad property is called private property. Now, what's the difference? Myself, the layman, when it comes to I don't want to say myself as the layman because I've studied a lot of where they come to their points of view from. I grew up with most of that propaganda being spewed at me as a child, and so I understand it. But for people that don't, when they hear, well, that's private property and private property is bad, but personal property is good, you might kind of like come away with this big question mark above your head. Like, what the hell are you talking about? What's the difference between private property and personal property? And I'm going to break down what I've been able to take away from this, and this might be a little bit demeaning or sarcastic even, but basically what it comes down to is anything that I own as an anarcho-socialist or an anarcho-communist, anything that I own is personal property. So my TV, my computer, my house, my bed, my car, if I am fortunate enough to have a car, only the bourgeoisies get cars. My bicycle, as more of them prefer bicycles over cars, so I'll say bicycle. My bicycle is personal property. But anything that's owned, so anything that I own is personal property. But anything that's owned by somebody who has more than what I do and that I'm envious of automatically becomes private property. So anything below my level of ownership is personal property and good. Everything that I own is good. Everything that people with more than me own is private property, and it's bad. So if you ever get confused and you're like, well, what's the difference between personal property and private property? It usually falls back to, if I have it, it's personal property and it's good. If you have it and I'm envious of it, it's private property and it's bad. So this idea of everybody owns everything and you can have a little bit of personal property, but the majority of everything out there is state owned. It belongs to all of us. That, first of all, it's inconsistent. If I can own a bicycle and I can own a house, then why can't I own a factory? What's the difference? If I can own a TV, then why can't I own a satellite that broadcasts TV to other people? It's this like arbitrary imaginary line that just is constantly, it's a goalpost that constantly changes. And most anarcho-socialists, as soon as they own more, the new stuff that they acquired is now also personal property. It moves from when somebody else owned it, it was private property, but as soon as they own it, they move the goalpost and now it becomes personal property. And so the whole idea of making a definition between, or making a line between personal property and private property, it's arbitrary. It changes from anarcho-socialist to anarcho-socialist. Each one has a different view of what constitutes private versus personal, and it's just complete bullshit in my opinion. So anyways, enough of that. But when it comes down to this idea of state ownership of all the property or public property, is where the actual problem with this concept arises, and where the tendency to lead towards oppression arises, and the tendency to lead towards poverty and lack of scarce goods tends to arrive. And that is when it comes to the conflict over scarce resources. It's just a matter of fact. There's only so much beachfront property. Everybody that wants to have a house on the beach can't, because there's more people that need houses than there's available beachfront property available. That was a redundant sentence. More people want to live on the beach than there are beach houses available. When that problem arises, you have to come up with some sort of way to work out, well, who gets to stay where? Resources are scarce. That's just the way it is. I know there's a lot of people that have this post-scarcity mentality, and when things become less scarce, then we might have to readjust the way that we look at these things. But if that even is possible and ever happens. But right now, resources are scarce, and we have to work within the world that we have, not the world that we imagine or the world that we want. We have to work with what we have. And what we have is scarcity. We have scarce resources. So how do we deal with conflict over scarce resources? There have been a lot of different ideas for how to do this. I think that probably the one that is most logically consistent and most adhered to by the libertarian or even the ANCAP, the anarcho-capitalist groups of people out there, is probably the Lockean homesteading principle, which is that you acquire property by mixing your labor with it. So resource plus labor equals owned property. There's a couple other different ideas. Some people have like claims. The King of England just claimed that he owned America at one point in time. There have been like lots of different ways that people try to go about establishing property ownership. I think that the Lockean homesteading principle makes the most sense, because it's not just, I see that, therefore I own it. It's, I see that, I know how to use my labor to improve it. Once it's improved, I have the right to the improvements of it. So this land is not being used by anybody. It's not being owned by anybody, quote unquote. But if I mix my labor with this land and build a house here, that's my house. Just kind of makes sense. I mean, that's, how do you decide who gets what? Well, who put the labor into developing it from a resource that was just sitting there idle to a resource that is now usable, and that person gets first claim on how to use it. And then that leads up a whole bunch of other questions about labor and people in the factories and blah, 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 blah. But maybe that will come up in a future episode of Live Free TV. So the Lockean homesteading principle idea basically comes down to, if you mix your labor with a resource, that resource and the usefulness of that resource now becomes yours. You own that property. Now, this helps avoid people taking what other people worked for. The Lockean homesteading principle helps to avoid somebody doing a bunch of work and then somebody else just coming in the middle of the night and taking what that person worked for. Because if you don't respect property rights at all, and you live in a society that respects property or doesn't respect property rights at all, you might be working all day to build a house. In the middle of the night, somebody might come and put up, or in the middle of the day, you go out to go collect some firewood and you come home and somebody else is living in your house. Well, how do we avoid that from happening? Lockean homesteading principles. This also helps avoid the tragedy of the commons problem, which is where if everybody owns everything, say there's a field and everybody owns that field. Well, then when it comes time to graze your cattle, everybody goes out and grazes on the field. And people start saying, well, shoot, if I don't get there earlier, my cattle don't get enough. And since it belongs to everybody, that means that I need to get out there quicker to get as much for my cattle before everybody else does. And if I don't get out there quicker, it's going to be gone by the time I get there. And then everybody else gets that same idea. Well, we need to get out there and get as much of it as quick as possible before it's all gone. And then that ideal, that it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. I've got to use as much as I can because it's going to be gone pretty soon. Well, since everybody's using as much as they possibly can because nobody owns it individually, then it is gone pretty soon. Eventually, everybody used up all of the resource, and that's the tragedy of the commons. To avoid this, and to avoid people working to build something and then having it just be taken away from them when they turn their back or just by brute force, Lockean homesteading principle by John Locke. If you guys don't know what I mean by Lockean homesteading principle, go look up John Locke and his writings. The Lockean homesteading principle pretty much eliminates the problem of the tragedy of the commons, and it helps avoid people from just taking things that they didn't work to actually create. So this pretty much applies to everything from houses to money to food that you grow in your garden. If you mix your resource or your energy, your labor with the resources to create something, whether that's to create a house, whether that's to earn some money, whether that's to grow some food in your garden, whatever it is, if you mix your resources with it, you own the benefit of the combination of that resource plus your labor. And realistically, property itself is an extension of you owning yourself. If you own yourself, then you obviously own your labor. And if you own your labor, then you mix it with scarce resources, and those scarce resources are improved by you mixing your labor with them. Then you own the result of the mixed labor plus the resources. Unless, of course, and this is where a lot of socialists will also disagree. Well, you showed up to the factory and you worked all day to make the widgets, so therefore the widgets are yours. Well, somebody else owned those widgets before you did, or somebody else owned the metal that was used to make the widgets before you did. They contracted with you to come in and add a little bit of your labor to what they've already labored for. It's not like the metal was just magically there. Somebody had to mine it out of the Somebody had to mine it out of the ground. Somebody had to stake a claim in the ground and dig holes first. Somebody had to fund all of that. Whoever funded all of that has first claim to it, and then you make an agreement or a contract with them saying, "Hey, I'll add some more of my labor to that resource that you already earn or that you already own to make that resource more valuable." And in exchange for that, I don't want the resource. I don't want claim of ownership over the resource. What I want is some of the money that you make from that resource so you can keep ownership of the resource. I want some of the money that you make from that resource. And that's what happens at a factory. And it's not the guy who owns the factory is making you a slave or denying you of your property rights because you mixed your labor with the resource. The resource was already owned. If you take an unowned resource or an unclaimed resource and mix your labor with it, then it's yours. But if you take a resource that somebody else has already, if you walk up to somebody or you walk up to somebody's house and you paint their house, that doesn't make it your house. Yeah, you mixed your labor with a resource that was there, but that doesn't transfer the property over to you because that property was already claimed by somebody. So they pay you to paint their house, but they don't give you their house. So when you show up to a factory and somebody pays you to improve upon the resources that they already own, that doesn't transfer right or claim of right over those resources to you. That entitles you to some sort of compensation, but it does not entitle you to a transfer of the ownership of the property. Okay, so I hope that's clear. So there's other ideas though, like the Native Americans. My grandpa's Chippewa Native American. And so I, as a younger guy, especially coming from the left, I studied a lot of the different tribes and the different tribes' concept of property rights. And theirs was, I don't want to say it was socialist, but they didn't see property the same way that John Locke did, obviously. They saw the earth itself as, and all the resources provided by the earth as property of the earth, and that we didn't actually own those things, that we don't own the land that we live on, that we are actually custodians of that. And we're not, when we take a claim of right to use something, it's not us conquering the past, it's us borrowing from the future. So when I take something and I make it better and I make it mine, I'm not actually taking something from the people of the past, I'm actually borrowing something from the people of the future. And that actually makes a lot of sense to me. I think that to be responsible, to have, to avoid polluting the crap out of the planet, to avoid complete deforestation of the entire planet, to avoid those things, it makes sense to me to have an understanding that there are going to be people that come after us, and we're just the current people that are in charge of the planet, and we need to do a good job of making sure that when they come, that there's still a planet to live on. I want to make sure that my offspring and their offspring are able to drink good, clean water, are able to breathe good, clean air. I think that most of us want that. Nobody, you get this idea that capitalists just care about profit over people and greed above the environment. And I've never met a capitalist that deep down in their heart is like, man, I just want to fill my pockets and I hope that my great grandkids have to drink polluted water in order to make that happen. So, I mean, it makes sense, and most of us understand we need to take care of what we have. But the best way to get people to take care of what we have is to give them and to respect their investment, to respect their, I don't even know the word. It's not coming to me right now, but to basically give people an attachment to something. It goes back to the tragedy of the commons. If nobody feels that it's theirs, if nobody thinks that this is private property, everybody's going to use it up as quick as possible. But as soon as somebody says this is my property, then they're going to be less inclined to just abuse that property. A good example of this is look at people that live in the house that they own versus people that live in a house that somebody else owns. People that live in the house that they own usually take a lot better care of the house that they live in, as opposed to somebody who's just renting a house. Because when you just rent a house, you don't have to worry about what's going to happen to it 5 years down the line, because you're going to be living in another house and you're not going to be paying rent there anymore. And it's not going to be your responsibility, and it's not going to be something that you need to worry about. But somebody who actually has a tangible investment in that house is going to take as good as possible care of that house. So giving people private property ownership of resources and respecting the concept of private property resource or ownership of resources makes a lot more sense to conserve and ensure that our children do have a bright future, do have clean water, do have land with trees. it makes a lot more sense to respect private property than to say, oh, everybody gets to own everything and the state therefore owns everything. And then again, the state is also the biggest polluter out there. So to think that the state, giving property ownership over to the state will stop pollution, it doesn't match up with what the state already is doing. So between all the different concepts of property that are out there, it might be hard to come to a conclusion or a conclusive idea of how property should be respected, how property should be conceptualized, and how property should be distributed. Distributed, that's an evil socialist word, I guess redistributed. So here's what my view is on property. I don't really believe that you own property because you die and you don't take it with you. So I understand that point of view. But I do believe that people have claims and superior claims and less superior claims to the right of use of a property. So a house, we'll go back to the example of home ownership. The person who owns the house has the highest claim of right to use. The person renting the house also has a claim of right to use, but theirs is not as high up as the superior claim to the right of the use of the house held by the property owner. This understanding satisfies the reality that you can't take the house with you, but it also satisfies the reality that we need to have some sort of way to arbitrate who has superior claims over scarce resources, who has the claim of ownership / custodial ship. I guess that's not a word, but you know what I'm saying. Who has the right to own and take care of this and make decisions for this scarce resource over who doesn't? So claim of rights is what I like to use. Instead of saying property rights, I like to say claim of right to use over something. And then the idea of public property, I don't really believe in public property. I don't believe in public parks. I don't believe in any of this stuff. I believe in unclaimed land and unclaimed resources. Nobody's claimed them. But as soon as somebody claims them, I believe that those people have the right to make the decision. And if people collectively want to claim a group or a plot of land, or people want to get together and say, hey, all of us are going to own this, all of us are going to do this, that's fine with me. But to think that people who have no interest in it whatsoever, just because they live in some sort of area, that gives them the right to make decisions for something that they don't actually go out and put their labor into mixing with the resources. And then we have this thing called public property. I don't really believe in that. I believe in claimed property with somebody or property that has somebody who has a claim to use, or a group of people with a claim to use, and unclaimed property. And that's really the only two types of real legitimate property, in my opinion, that match up with reality. I wanted to get into intellectual property. In fact, I will get into intellectual. This one's going to run a little bit longer than 30 minutes. So intellectual property, this is highly disputed as well. Intellectual property is the idea that you can own an idea. I mean, I took a lot of labor to create that idea, therefore I own that idea. I do not believe in this. I do not believe in intellectual property whatsoever. Intellectual property, number one, it's not a scarce resource. If I have an idea and I tell you about it, now you've got it. You didn't deplete my idea at all. It's not like in order for me to share an idea with you, I have to give up ownership of the idea myself. It's still right here. And now it's right there. It's like fire. If I take a torch and I give you some fire off of my torch, that doesn't take away the fire from my torch. If I light your torch with my torch, now we both have fire. But I wasn't diminished. I wasn't taken from. You didn't steal from me by having the fire added to your torch. So that's kind of how like an idea works. When somebody steals your idea, they're not stealing anything from you. You still have your idea. Theft implies that you had something and you no longer have it. When somebody commits theft of an idea, the second part that necessitates theft, the part where you no longer have it, doesn't exist. So ideas are not property. The biggest problem with intellectual property, in my opinion, is that intellectual property, number one, it's not a scarce resource like I already went over, but number two, intellectual property infringes on people's real property rights. Because if I have an idea about how to compose a song, and I say, you play these keys in this particular fashion, you put your finger on this part of the keyboard, then you put your finger on this part of the keyboard, and then you hit these keys together and you play them at this specific speed in this specific order, and that's the song. And I go and I copyright that song. What I've done is I've told you, if you own a piano, even though you bought that piano, you cannot use it in this specific way. And those fingers that are yours, you cannot use those fingers in a specific way. So when I get a copyright on how to play a specific section of music, what I'm actually doing is saying my claim to an idea is superior to your claim of ownership over your own fingers and your own piano. My idea, my intellectual property, supersedes your tangible property. And I don't agree with that whatsoever, because that's basically making slaves of everybody else. Another problem with intellectual property is it's a huge violation of free speech. It's saying, because I copyrighted this idea, I have the right to control what you can and can't say. And when it comes to like computer codes and stuff like that, programming is just all code. It's all just speech. It's all languages. HTML, PHP, CSS, C++, C++, Python. These are languages. And for me to say, I use the language in this specific manner, and therefore you're not allowed to use the language in that same specific manner, or you can't copy the language the way that I wrote this language, you can't copy it and use the same language the same way that I did. That's me saying you don't have freedom of speech. So all around, intellectual property does not meet the requirements of tangible property. And to be enforced, intellectual property has to infringe on tangible property rights. So I do not agree with intellectual property whatsoever. I'm going to cut it short, or not short, actually, I've gone past my time. I'm going to cut it off right there. If you want more, if you were intrigued by this conversation, if you thought that you maybe learned something from it and you want to possibly absorb more of my grand mental superiority, made me sound like a megalomaniac. If you want to enjoy more conversations like this, head over to LiveFreeFM.com. That's LiveFreeFM.com. And like I said at the beginning of the show, check out all of the archived episodes of Live Free FM that I have over there. It's a freaking podcast, yo. It's probably the best podcast that ever has graced the internet airwaves. So if you want to check that out, go over to livefreefm.com and subscribe. Hit the subscribe button. And if you think I'm a complete jackass or you want to correct anything that I said, make sure to leave a comment. And if you agreed with what I said, make sure to share this video on whatever social networking site you prefer. Until next week, this is Nathan Frazier, Live Free TV, right here on the Voluntary Virtues Network. I will catch you guys later. Peace.